Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you tuning in today, we welcome you in. In our last episode, we were talking about Charlie Chaplin and his connection to the Bank of England. I've started to do a bit of a dive into that connection, but the Bank of England is a humongous subject. I mean, it starts off in the 1600s and is continuing to the present day. So it's a very careful tapestry that you have to unravel thread by thread. Hence the extremely pathetic amount of money you see before you, because this episode will kind of be about money, but more the history and how it relates to people. Now, the Bank of England is currently a central bank, but it wasn't always so. And when you're dealing with something with as much history as the Bank of England, you kind of got to look for specific periods. So one I chose to look at was World War I. There were a lot of funny things happening around World War I. So I zeroed in on it, and I looked at the president. Now, first of all, let's look at the history of the Bank of England in 1913. This was a pivotal year for the bank, but not for the reasons that you might imagine. In the United States, there is a wonderful conspiracy event at this point where they opened their national central bank, and it was done on Christmas Eve, and most of the voters were at home and they snuck the legislation through. The Bank of England was already a central bank and had been going like gangbusters for hundreds of years already. But in 1913, something else significant happened to the Bank of England. Walter Cunliffe was appointed the minister of the bank, the president for lack of better. Oh, and also the suffragettes tried to bomb it. Yes, 1913, we have to remember this is a time where women were still really not allowed to work. They weren't allowed to vote. They were not allowed to do pretty much anything that they're allowed to do today. So the suffragettes bombed the Bank of England. And this was not unique to the Bank of England. It was happening all over Europe. Women and other people who were being oppressed were bombing public institutions to let people know, hey, we're not going to take it. And I think we can realize in the end, they were right. People deserve equal rights. If you're a human being, you deserve the same rights as every other human being. But that's a story for another time. The president, the minister in charge of the Bank of England, Sir Walter Cunliffe, is a very interesting man. At this point in his life, he was in his late 60s. He would only live till 1920, from 1855 to 1920. Not a short life, but not a long one. And at this point, he's the head of the Bank of England, and he immediately is thrust into this problem where suffragettes have targeted him and his workplace for a bombing. And next year, in 1914, the First World War is going to start. Our friend Walter Cunliffe was a pretty strict old man, even by the standards of the day. One of the things he invented was the dress code for women, because men were expected to know how to dress properly, but he was offended by the fact that women were wearing dresses that were not all white. And one of the rules he came up with was women could only wear white dresses without stains and without patterns during the summer months. This is how much of a control freak he was, despite the fact his institution had been targeted by the suffragettes who were saying, hey, we want equal rights. He still wanted to lay down the law and say, you have equal rights provided you dress the way that I tell you and you do what I tell you. Interesting fellow. He goes into the war, and one of the more interesting things he says is that during the middle of the war, keep in mind, this is when things are at their worst during World War I, and the Germans are continually surging forward, and it's a huge drain of men, manpower, and resources. He's saying that the Bank of England has tons and tons of gold, and there's nothing to worry about. Now, supposedly, The Bank of England gold reserves equal almost 5% of what humanity has ever pulled out of the ground. People talk about Fort Knox, but the Bank of England seems to have a disproportionate amount of gold hidden away. Part of that gold comes from their initial founding, and it keeps a heavy position in gold. They always have some squirreled away for a bad day, which I find very interesting. Most banks have not been on the gold standard for generations, but they all still value gold. It's something they don't like the public having. They always want to pass laws restricting what people can have and what we can have. And indeed, in the United States, it was illegal to own gold for almost 30 years. In Britain, they just want to make it very expensive so you can't afford it. It's a play toy for the rich, not for bozos like you and I. But Mr. Cunliffe, who, by the way, succeeded the gentleman whose son was acting with Charlie Chaplin, he had a very liberal financial policy. During the war, they were trying to stop the gold payments, and they were trying to ensure that foreign securities would not be traded. And he said, no, we're going to keep doing it, which was in violation of what everybody else was doing at the time. This clever little move probably kept England liquid and probably allowed the economy to grow as much as it did during the war period. So financially, yeah, man's a genius. Personally, yeah, I wouldn't give you $5 to meet him. Now, the interesting thing about Walter Cunliffe is when you start looking into his family history. His brother, Arnold, married an actress. His son married an actress. So again, we're seeing this banking Hollywood, well, it's not Hollywood in Britain, it's, the theater, but we're seeing this connection come out time and time again. The Bank of England like themselves some actors and actresses. And I purposely included both sexes, all genders, because we know that LGBTQ rights were still generations away from being considered. And if women's rights are non-existent, can you imagine how hard it would be on the LGBTQ community? Even in the 1940s, Alan Turing, who was critical to winning the war, was being persecuted because he was a homosexual. So here we are in the 1913 to 1918 period. We don't even know what kind of dealings are going on back doors. I always kind of wonder if they married actresses simply because they needed a good beard. But there's no way to prove it. There never will be, unless you find some sort of sensational diary. And I'm not in the process of doing archaeology looking for diaries. I'm sure these families have them wrapped up and hidden away somewhere anyway, so you'd really have to be the friend of someone to get into it. Anyway, Walter Cunliffe passed away in 1920. Again, not a short life, not a long life, but certainly an influential one. And all around him, people are marrying actresses. His son, his brother, etc. He was already rich. He started a bank with both of his brothers that eventually merged with another bank to become another big bank, and that's how he got into the Bank of England. Basically because banks like to buy things up. Well, that's the neat thing about money. You can become famous if you have enough money. Not paltry money like this. I'm talking like, millions and billions. You can get very famous. Shark Tank, for example. A couple millionaires sit there and they get famous just simply by saying your idea is good or your idea is crap. It doesn't even cost them very much money overall. They're sitting there having fun spitballing. Or you can marry a famous actress and people immediately saying, ooh, look who she married, and you get fame out of that. Money and fame can be transferred for one another. It's an interesting cycle. The bankers seem to have been picking up on that trend very early. you sponsor famous people, you become famous by proxy. While today, most people don't know who Walter Cunliffe was, they do know who the Bank of England is. And it's very easy to find out what goes on for the Bank of England at any given time. I'm only sticking with this period because it relates directly to my Charlie Chaplin episode, and because naturally you're going to look between the war periods and see who's running the bank, because wars involve built strategy. You can be like Germany in World War II and overrun people, but in the long term, it's going to be a slugging match, and you need to make sure your industry is mobilized, your finances are mobilized, you have your workers mobilized, not just your soldiers, your workers, and you can actually commit to building battleships and tanks and airplanes and all sorts of crazy things in huge amounts. And World War I was really I don't want to call it a dry run or a test run, but it was really where the foundations of this philosophy got laid down. So that's why I wanted to look into Walter Cunliffe, to see who it was that was the one who persecuted the war in the most effective way. Because Britain came out of World War I not too bad overall. Their industrial base was intact. Yes, they were a little bit poorer, but overall they were doing pretty good. And most importantly, their financial institutions were rock solid. In Canada, our financial institutions are rock solid. That's one of the things that we have inherited. Compared to the United States in 2008, our financial institutions never even blinked. After the 2020 pandemic, our financial institutions haven't blinked. So, we have to look at financial institutions through time and who they connect to. What is this banking Hollywood connection? Hollywood just meaning actors and actresses in general. Well, very simply put, Hollywood needs money to make productions, and bankers like to be known that that's their wife or that's their husband or whatever the case is performing on stage. It's more complicated, but then you have those same actors and actresses going on tour over in war zones to try to bring, joy and relaxation to the troops by performing whatever their hit is. And once again, that turns around and benefits the bankers, because if the troops are happy and have high morale, they're going to perform better. And that means the bankers are going to be funding more arms and ammunitions to go over there. It's all a very twisted cycle, and it all feeds the military-industrial complex. So, bankers and actors and actresses, all together in the same circle. Get famous enough, you get to hang out with bankers, and your life is pretty much on easy street. But that's enough of that for now. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please hit like, share, and subscribe. And we hope you have a fantastic day.